Our topic tonight, as you know, is the Arab Spring and the pursuit of democracy. And our guest, Ken Wollack, as you know, is president of the National Democratic Institute, which is loosely an arm of the Democratic Party, designed for the promotion of democracy in the world. His organization, as I understand it, has offices in 70 countries or so. He himself has been on 5 continents in the work of that organization. He spent a lot of his adult life in that capacity. He, by the way, worked on the McGovern campaign in '72. He was the legislative director for the Arab-Israeli PAC for 7 years. He also was a co-editor of the Middle East Policy Survey. And before joining the National Democratic Institute, first as their executive vice president, and then since 1996 as its president. And all of us know that the question of promoting democracy in the world is an extraordinarily complex one. The theoretical issues of whether we should be doing it, what its consequences are, what regimes make sense for what societies, whether they fit with our national interests or not, are all things that in his job he's had to think about. And I know he wrote at least one article on the comparison of U.S. values and U.S. interests, which captures that kind of tension, I think. And he certainly knows the day-by-day tactics and processes which are important in trying to facilitate democracy and encourage it. So I think all of you are as eager as I am to hear his remarks. It's my pleasure to present Mr. Ken Wollack.
It's a very, very nice crowd. I asked Frank how long I should speak before I stood up here, and he said, "You can speak as long as you want." He said, "We're leaving in 30 minutes." But I'm just joking. I had prepared remarks, but I thought when I arrived I'd throw those out and just try to be as informal as possible. Try to give you a little sense of not only what I do and organizations like ours do overseas, how this fits into U.S. foreign policy, and then talk a little bit about recent events over the last 15 years in the Middle East, but mostly about developments since the beginning of the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening. I think a number of Saudi officials would rather call it the Arab Troubles, and then hopefully we can have more of a question and answer, more of a dialogue, because some of the issues Frank talked about, I think, are issues that are debated all the time in Washington, particularly in the aftermath of the Iraq War, when I think democracy promotion became somewhat controversial. I think those days have passed us, but some of those issues, I think, come up time and time again, and we have to deal with it in Washington. Let me begin by saying that we're celebrating, and I'm saying this as a large D Democrat as well as a small D Democrat, we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of a speech that President Ronald Reagan gave before the British Parliament. It's 30 years ago, in which he called for the United States to support democratic institutions and processes overseas. And he did this building on the human rights policy of the Carter administration. And President Carter, who promoted the notion of defending individual rights of those who were being brutalized by authoritarian regimes, that Ronald Reagan took it one step further and said the United States should be engaged in supporting broadly democratic principles and institutions. Out of that speech came a bipartisan congressional initiative led by the then chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a Democrat, Dante Fascell from Florida. And the result of that initiative was the National Endowment for Democracy, a bipartisan institute that was a grant-making institute. And the legislation envisioned 4 organizations, that were part of our own democratic system that would support their counterparts overseas in a sort of an operational way. One affiliated with the Democratic Party, one with the Republican Party, one with the labor movement, and one with the business community. And we began in 1983. And interestingly, the notion of a party institute, an institute affiliated with a party, was very new to the United States and quite controversial in those early days. But it was not new to the rest of the world, because you had political parties that had organized around social democratic ideology, Christian democratic ideology, liberal, large L liberal ideologies, and conservative ideologies. And matter of fact, they had banded together in what was called the four large international groupings of political parties. And ironically, it was the German party foundations that played such an important role in helping to steer Spain and Portugal in the 1970s into the democratic camp, overcoming the dictatorship in both of those countries. And it was ironic, since it was the United States during occupation that pushed very hard on the new Germany to invest heavily in their political parties, because it was the weakness of the party system under the Weimar Republic that contributed to the rise of Nazism. And the German Bundestag, the parliament, invested huge amounts of money into these political party-affiliated institutions. One with the Social Democratic Party, one with the Liberal Party, one with the Green Party, one with the Christian Democratic Party. They even have one now with the Communist Party, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And so in a sense, we were patterned after those foundations. From the outset, Dante Fascell liked to say he thought this was something everybody would love, that here you had Republicans and Democrats and labor and business all coming together to support what he considered, and many others in the Congress and elsewhere considered, fundamental democratic principles. But at the outset, it was also something for everybody to hate. And so you have those on the left in Congress that felt that this was a Ronald Reagan Cold War initiative. They felt that we were going to be engaged in cultural imperialism, going around the world pushing the American political system. That this would be a rogue operation. Some described it as junketeering. I remember one senator called it the Eatin', Meetin', and Greetin' organizations. And those on the right also opposed it on the ground that we were engaged in this larger struggle against the Soviet Union and communism, and we shouldn't be questioning our friends around the world, even though they may be brutalizing their own citizens. So why should we challenge people like Ferdinand Marcos and Augusto Pinochet, when in fact they were supporters of the United States against our largest adversary? So this debate went on for literally years, and the appropriation in Congress of $30 million for this initiative, debates used to go on in the Senate and the House for 5 and 6 hours at a time. Ted Kennedy was a big proponent of it, and Barney Frank was a big opponent. Orrin Hatch was a big supporter, and Jesse Helms was a big opponent. And you never understood, you kept looking over which shoulder. And then two major events changed the whole debate in Washington, and that was the snap elections in the Philippines in 1986, in which Corazon Aquino defeated Ferdinand Marcos, and the plebiscite in Chile in 1988, in which the no vote, which denied Pinochet 8 more years as president of Chile, the no vote prevailed. And in both of those institutes, the organization that I represent, chaired for many years by Walter Mondale, Madeleine Albright was our founding vice chair, and she became chairman when she left the State Department. Our institute and the others played, I think, a very constructive and important role in both of those struggles. And what became apparent in the debate in Washington was that there was something between the two political extremes in these countries. That between Pinochet and the communist insurgency in Chile, and Pinochet, like Mubarak many years later, liked to say that the alternative to me was the communists. as Marcos commonly did, that suddenly in both of those institutes a realization that these two political extremes needed each other, and there was a symbiotic relationship between the two, between the dictator and the violent communist insurgency. And everything in between got marginalized, from the far left to the right. And finally, on the Republican side, they understood that there was something. There was a democratic middle in these countries. And that given an opportunity to organize, an opportunity to participate in the process, they provided a democratic alternative to these two extremes. And they drew strength and sustenance and solidarity from the attention and support that they received from the international community. And for the left in the Congress, they understood and realized that this initiative was not just a Cold War initiative, that it was really an initiative that was dedicated to fundamental democratic processes. And for NDI, we believed at the outset that this was, we were proud of our Democratic Party roots, we were proud that we were an American organization, but we did not view this as an American enterprise. And we did not see it as the notion of preaching the American political system, but rather a deep-seated belief in a common humanity, that ultimately people want the same thing, whether they're Latin Americans or Africans or Asians or Middle Easterners. They want to put food on their table, they want to have housing, they want to have jobs, and they want to have a political voice. They want to have a say. And what is interesting is, in recent years, even the traditional development community that had always believed that economic development would come first, that all you have to do, what people really wanted was food on the table, and that democracy and stability would come after that, finally understood that there was an interconnectedness between political and economic reform, and that people were in a demanding mood. They wanted both. And after those two events, the plebiscite in Chile and the snap elections in the Philippines, and the work that was done by NDI and some of the other organizations, the debate changed. And there became very, very broad bipartisan support. I have members on my board who voted against this in those early days. And so then you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, and everyone became very supportive of this notion, and it became quite sexy, this notion of supporting democracy globally. And then you had the Bush administration that, like his predecessor, placed democracy promotion or democracy support, because we do very little promoting, we do a lot of responding to what is taking place on the ground around the world. He, like Bill Clinton, put democracy at the forefront of policy, but two things happened. Number one, the rhetoric was rather jarring by the president. It created the impression that somehow we were exporting something rather than supporting something. And secondly, you had two wars, and particularly the war in Iraq. And the conflation of democracy promotion with military interventionism tarnished the whole notion of democracy support. So I used to go around the country, also many times with my Republican counterpart, and I'd walk into rooms like this, and the first question is, you can't impose democracy on countries. And it would take an entire evening talking to people about what we did and how we do it. And by the end of the evening, I convinced everybody this is the right thing to do. But it took an entire evening to do it. And the controversy surrounding this conflation of democracy programs, which I don't believe had anything to do with the war in Iraq. And what was interesting, the only person that provided funding for democracy work in Iraq was not the Bush administration, it was Senator Ted Kennedy, who introduced the legislation every year to provide democracy assistance in Iraq, opposed by the Bush administration at the time. And I remember saying to Senator Kennedy, there are two people that believe deeply in democracy in Iraq, the president who talks about it and the senator who does something about it. But what happened was there was a prediction that when the Obama administration came in, because of the controversy surrounding democracy work, that it would be abandoned by the new administration. It didn't happen. And while the rhetoric was quite different, the funding for this type of work continued. And in a series of speeches by the president in Accra, in Oslo, in Prague, in New York, and elsewhere, the president reaffirmed what has traditionally been a bipartisan commitment to support human rights and democracy around the world, and the responsibilities of the United States to pursue a policy that served our interests but also reflected our values as well. There has long been a view by so-called foreign policy experts that societies were not ready for democracy. Although I never knew a society that was ready for dictatorship. And if people had a choice, I don't think they would choose dictatorship over democracy. And the polls all show that there isn't a clash of civilizations. This is something shared by everybody. But there was always the argument that somehow Latin Americans were not predisposed to democracy because of belief in the strong man, in the Caudillo, and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. There was the notion in Asia that the Asians would not embrace democracy because of Confucianism, or tribalism in Africa. Even Germanic cultures was viewed by the experts as being alien to democracy. And these views of the pessimists, the experts, there was always sort of this easy wisdom that somehow no one is ready to rule themselves. And that view was somehow enduring. But over the past 30 years, during this so-called third wave of democratization, it tended to challenge these conventional views.
May I
Yes, sir.
just request that you point your voice toward the mic?
Toward the mic? Okay.
Consistently. Sometimes you talk over your left or your right shoulder.
I'm trying to be bipartisan here. That's what I'm trying to, okay. I'll play it straight down the middle. Okay. But there was something quite enduring about the Middle East. And while there was tremendous efforts to support democratization in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, that somehow this traditional view of the Middle East, Islam was incompatible with democracy, that the Arab people were not ready, that our interests in oil or diplomacy, what my first boss in Washington called the petro-diplomatic complex, that somehow this was the one region of the world that would buck the trend, that people were not going to demand democracy in that region. But for those of us who were working on the ground for the last 15 years in the Middle East, in about 15 countries, working with women's organizations, working with civic groups, working with political parties, working with parliamentarians, we saw something quite different. We saw the effect of satellite television, social media. We saw the rise of reformers that were trying to provide an alternative to the two extremes between the religious extremists and the dictatorial regimes. And they could be found in many places around the region. And you add to that the youth bulge and corrupt regimes, and you had all the ingredients for the uprisings we saw a year and a half ago. So we couldn't predict when this was going to happen, but we knew something was taking place. And unfortunately, for the international community, who never believed change was really possible in this region of the world, we relied heavily on our relationships with the one person in each country. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but with the regime, with the one person, with the guy, and they were all guys. And somehow it was easier to deal with the Assads and the Mubaraks and the Ben Alis and even the Gaddafis, the Salehs in Yemen, because it was easy in the pursuit of short-term security interests. These were the people who could cut deals. And so democracy support programs were sort of left to the fringes of the Middle East, in places like Morocco and places like Yemen. And our relationships on the ground were left to these handful of elites. And so basically officialdom in Washington and in capitals all over the world were missing something profound that was taking place on the ground. And then what happened was a match was lit, and that was the self-emulation of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia. And that was a reaction, a violent reaction to a predatory state. The notion of human dignity, the notion of how a street vendor was being treated by the police. And what is interesting to all those traditional economic development people who said that, well, people really cared about feeding and all you have to do is feed people, it's interesting that the millions of people that went on the squares in Tunis, in Cairo, in Sana'a, in Manama, in Bahrain, there was not one sign, one piece of graffiti that said we want lower bread prices. We want more jobs. Now, there was the expectation that new systems would be better at delivering those, and non-corruptible regimes, clean government, would deliver economic benefits. But all the demands on the streets were about human dignity, was about democracy, was about human rights. They were all political demands. Now, when you look at the Middle East, those regimes that were the most authoritarian were the ones where the demand for ouster, complete change, was the greatest. In places like Libya, Tunisia, Egypt. Then there were those where the current governments had a little more legitimacy and professed to support reform that managed to stay on longer, and the demands were much more modest. These were places like Jordan, Morocco, Yemen, and Bahrain. And what happened is the King of Morocco and the King of Jordan began a major reform process. It still comes short for the demands of many people in those countries, but at least you had young monarchs who had a degree of legitimacy in their country, who saw that the regimes had to change, which thwarted some of the more radical demands for political change. And unfortunately, in Yemen and in Bahrain, the governments in both places refused to heed those demands, and therefore created more radical demands for change in both of those places. Then you had a number of the Gulf states that were able to have enough money where they could buy off discontent, at least for a time. Now, we have seen, I think, over the last several months, the rise again of the pessimists, the so-called experts, who look around and see what has happened in the region since the Arab Spring name was coined, and now they call it the Arab Winter. And the primary reason is the rise of Islamist parties, which should never have come as a surprise to anybody. Because these regimes created, just like Marcos did and just like Pinochet, they created this polarization. So in Egypt, if you wanted to talk about politics, there was only one place to go, and that was in the mosque. And so what Mubarak was so effective of doing is saying, if you don't have me, what you have is the guys with the beards and the hats. And so what he did is quash everything, tried to quash everything in between. So the only parties, the only groups that citizens knew were the Islamist-based organizations. And what citizens knew were these were uncorruptible organizations. They were a reaction to the predatory, corrupt state that was treating them so poorly. So it was only natural that these organizations, particularly in an initial election, was going to do quite well. But these groups are not monolithic, the Islamic-based groups, whether it's the PJD in Morocco, the Ennahda Party in Tunisia, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Islah Party in Yemen, which formed a coalition with the Secular Socialist Party against President Saleh of Yemen, the Islamic Action Front in Jordan. So they don't have, and they're quite different from Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, both of which are committed to violence, because none of those other parties have violence as part of their platform or part of their policies. And so what you have right now happening in the Middle East, and why I'm in the optimism business, not in the pessimism business, and Americans patience is not a great virtue of Americans. We want to judge this process literally on a monthly basis. This is a 20-year proposition. And that ultimately, I believe, that through the practice of democracy, that these parties and these entities will either change to where the people of these countries want, or they will be voted out of office in the next election. So we are seeing the beginning of a very, very long process. And the road is going to be built inch by inch. So ultimately, I think the role of the international community and the role of the United States is not to try to impose some outside system or process on the Arab people, but rather understand the hopes and aspirations of those people and to support indigenous demands for systems that provide citizens a voice, that promote pluralism, whether they are secular or they are Islamist, and that over time, through the practice of democracy, not some great Reformation movement, but through the practice of democracy, you will see the more extreme elements recede, as what took place in Turkey. If you look at the ruling party in Turkey, the AK party, and its predecessor, the Welfare Party, led by Prime Minister Erdogan, when you look at the platform of Prime Minister Erdogan when he was mayor of Istanbul to where he is and the ruling party is today, it's quite different. And it's different primarily because that's where the Turkish people are. And I think ultimately that will take place. Now in Egypt, probably, and in Bahrain, and certainly in Syria, you have the three most difficult situations today. In Syria, we are either at the beginning of an all-out civil war, or we're in the midst of a civil war, which is going to continue to be bloody, and that ultimately will lead to the fall of the Assad regime, but the question becomes when. In Egypt, what we saw was a counter-revolutionary movement led by the military that continues to this day. Fear of losing political power, fear of losing economic power, what some are calling a soft coup. And now you will have struggle between the military, between civil society, between political parties, between the new government, between what will be a new parliament after new elections are held. But you're seeing now a struggle between centers of power that never existed before. And how will end, I don't know. But again, the Egyptian people are in a demanding mood. And I think that ultimately the story has not been written yet on the transition. And in Bahrain, where you have a ruling family that would prefer to describe the battle as between Iran, an Iranian-supported Shia in their country that comprises 65 to 70% of the population. They have created, unfortunately, another self-fulfilling prophecy. Because what they are doing is not only going after radical Shias, but they're going after business people, they're going after doctors, they're going after everybody in the middle, and trying to create that same polarized environment. It's either us or radical Shiism and Tehran. And the only thing that stands between Tehran and Saudi Arabia is the Khalifa family in Bahrain and the American Fifth Fleet. So therefore, we have a lot of uncertainties, and those pessimists that I talked about earlier breed on uncertainty. And there are many of those experts and many of those pessimists that would like to roll back the clock for about 2 years. But there is one thing to remember about autocratic regimes, and that is it's very hard to fine-tune your dictator. You don't know who you're going to get. You don't know whether you're going to get a more benign leader like Museveni in Uganda, or you're going to get a Stalin or a Pinochet or a Hitler. It's very difficult in these situations. And that ultimately, again, the people in the region will continue to be in a demanding mood. And we're at a period right now, I think the international community, in that there is no rolling back the clock, because while these autocratic regimes seem to be stable, they are only stable until they become destabilized. And there is no rolling the clock back. And that we have to begin to understand that we have to extend our relationships well beyond the ruling elite. We have to understand the aspirations of citizens in these countries. And we have to fashion a policy, which I think we are doing in a number of places. We have to fashion a policy that supports those aspirations in order to build a more peaceful and prosperous region, and ultimately a more peaceful and prosperous world. And so I remain very, very hopeful about the Arab Spring. I will concede that maybe we should call it the Arab opportunities. But the region will never be the same. And I think that all of us in our lifetime who thought that the fall of the wall was the most important event of our lifetime, probably that will be replaced by what is taking place today in the Middle East. And I think the challenge for all of us, for the international community in general, the United States in particular, is to be on the right side of history when this story is finally told 20, 30 years from now. So thank you very much. Yes. Would it be wise to continue to support Egypt? Yes. But the question is how you support Egypt. We have been providing, you may have read in the paper that NDI is one of the number of organizations who was kicked out of the country and whose staff remains in the country and is going through a trial right now. The next hearing is on July 4th. And this created the charges against the American and German organizations operating in Egypt, and our staffs created a crisis in Egyptian-U.S. relations. Yes, I think we ought to be supporting the Egyptians, but right now we supply the Egyptians about $1.5 billion a year, of which $1.3 billion is in military assistance and $250 million in economic assistance. And I think we have to sit down with the duly elected government of the country and to make a determination how those funds will be spent. And so therefore, while we have to maintain our relationship with the Egyptian military, It should not be a relationship that is exclusive. And that our primary partners should be a duly elected government of the country and a duly elected parliament of the country. And so it has to be seen that we have an Egypt policy, not a military policy in Egypt. And I think policymakers right now understand that, and I think they're waiting for a new beginning in Egypt, which the military right now is making it very difficult to foresee at this moment. But yes, I think we still have to, because the Egyptians have to develop economically. They've been devastated by the events over the last year and a half. The question was, are we not Johnny-come-latelys to supporting sort of democratic forces when we have been supporting autocrats around the world? I will come to the defense of the U.S. over the last 30 years. I think that there has been, it hasn't been that we're perfect, and people can be critical of a selective application of democracy. But there has been a sea change in U.S. policy over the last 30 years. Today, every ambassador has democracy and human rights as part of his or her portfolio. That was not true 30 years ago. And there were very, very courageous ambassadors, even during the times in the Philippines and the times of Chile, that to this day the Chileans will tell you that Ambassador Harry Barnes was there, and the embassy was their address during those very dark days under Pinochet's rule. And even people that some may not support here, during the administration, went to Capitol Hill, asked for $1 million extra money to support the democratic forces against Pinochet. So now we can argue whether democracy in terms of our bilateral relationship is in some places it's not the number one or number two issue, and it may be the 10th issue. In other places it's high priority, in other places it's low priority. But even in the places that are low priority, those are the places where organizations like ours operate with government money and with government support. So I think it's much more complex. Right now you have the Gulf states that are quite angry at the United States because they believe that we threw Mubarak under the bus. The argument is nonsense, but they believe that. So I think there have been many places where the United States has courageously stood up for people. The United States Congress has courageously stood up for Democrats. And there are other places that our history is not as proud. But I think that U.S. policy is also projected by organizations like ours and people-to-people relationships. And so I think the world has changed over the last 30 years, and the U.S. has changed over the last 30 years. Well, I like to think that the work that we do is not policing the world. I like to think that the work that we do reflects our values, and if we can, I believe a more democratic world is a more peaceful place, and it saves us money in the long term. You know, the countries that brutalize their own citizens are more likely to go to war against their neighbors. And so therefore, there are investments that our country can make to make the world more peaceful. In this interconnected world, what happens in one place for good or for evil not only affects the citizens of those countries. In this interconnected world, it affects citizens in the region, and it affects citizens around the world. We saw this on 9/11. We see it in terms of disease. So we have, I think, ultimately a responsibility to help each other. It serves the best interests of this country from a strategic standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a political standpoint, and it serves the interests of those countries as well. So I think the small amount of money that this country spends on foreign aid is an investment, and we get it back in terms of that investment. Being a country isolated from the rest of the world is not going to make the world any better. Now, the question is how we intervene and how we engage in the rest of the world. But believe me, we'd be much worse shape if we suddenly shut ourselves off from the rest of the world. We would be in a worse place. Yes. Yes, sir. How is the Syrian situation going to end up? Play out? I think eventually Assad will be forced to leave. I mean, the whole notion now is trying to find a Yemen solution to Syria. The Yemen solution was an agreement that was sponsored by the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, and what it did was a very complex transition process in which President Saleh stepped down. He handed power over to his vice president, an agreement not to prosecute him or his family members. Unfortunately, President Saleh is still in Yemen. His family is still in power. He is trying to manipulate things from behind the scenes. But they're looking for a situation that can provide a safe haven for him, either in the country or outside the country, and can provide some transfer of power. But the challenges are enormous. It's very difficult to plan for a transition process when thousands upon thousands of people are being killed every day. And so I think ultimately, given the brutality of the regime, that and also for Assad to see what's happened with some of his colleagues in the region, Mubarak and Gaddafi, that it's going to get a lot bloodier and a lot more tragic than it is now before that happens. And so the question only is when. And then you have a very, very disorganized and very disparate opposition. And it's going to take them a great deal of time to plan for something that takes into account the sectarian nature of Syrian society. But it's going to take tremendous engagement of the international community to support a process there. The question is about this revolution, these revolutions spreading into Iran, and what the United States can do to either support or promote changes in Iran. Right now, the focus, of course, in Iran is the development of nuclear weaponry and the sanctions regime that has been put in place. I think you have a large democratic movement that exists in the country, but a very brutal government that is willing to, and a very sophisticated government that is willing to nip any type of revolution brutally. They don't mind shooting on their own people, unlike the Egyptian military. So I think you have a lot of things going on in Iran. You have fissures within the ruling regime. You have the economic sanctions, which are beginning to hit the average Iranian. You have democratic movements that are nascent democratic movements in the country. And it is challenging to try to find a way to support them because we have to follow basically their lead. And oftentimes they're nervous about being identified as with outside forces supporting them. So there are many, many programs that are taking place supporting young democratic reformers, helping them communicate with one another, helping them to report to the international community what's taking place on the ground. And I think that those forces are probably at any given time ready to come to the surface, but I can never predict when those breakthroughs are going to happen. But it has all the ingredients, with the fissures within the regime, people that are willing to struggle for these issues, and an international community that is engaged in a sanctions regime. So I think, again, it's only a matter of time. And we're probably doing as much, we meaning the United States and the international, as much as we can, as much as the environment will bear. The question is, do we have good intelligence in terms of, we meaning the outside world, good intelligence of what is going on the ground in Syria and who's who? Yes and no. I think that it's, we have had many meetings with the Syrian National Council, which is the body that, the opposition body. The Turks are very much engaged with them. The Jordanians are as well. They travel outside of Syria often. So I think there is a great deal of knowledge of who these people are. But the problem is that it's a collection of very diverse individuals. And you have, the traditional sectarian splits that exist. The leader right now of the SNC, the new leader, is a Kurd. And so you have a lot of potential divisions among them. And the only thing that unites them right now is getting rid of the regime, and very little after that. But Turkey has a very big investment in supporting them. The Jordanians do as well, and I think generally the international community does. And I think everybody is just trying to get to know them right now, and trying to do it in the midst of a civil war, which is very difficult, as it was difficult in Libya. Because then not only do you have the Syrian National Council, but you also have the resistance, you have the military, and what are the relationships that exist, and who controls who. And all of these things are very fluid. And so while people and know movements and maintain contact, there's a lot people don't know. Yes, the progress in Libya. Yes, the progress has been slow in Libya. There were to be elections already, and they were postponed for 18 days. What has been sort of heartbreaking in Libya is you had a well-intentioned transitional national council, similar to the Syrian National Council, that brought together people initially primarily from the East and then from the West, that represented all sectors of society. But the one thing that all Libyans can agree with right now is they are dissatisfied with the Transitional National Council. And so as quickly as they can get credible elections under their belt, and that the transitional government removes itself, and that they can write a constitution, the better Libya will be. You have a lot of very difficult issues, tribal issues, East-West issues. But there's one thing that gives me great hope in Libya. Libya is a very pious society, but it's not a very insular society in the sense that the Libyans want to be part of something larger than themselves. They're very eager for the international community to be there. And so I think over the long term, but it's going to be very difficult. And these last few months have been very challenging. And you have a government that's been unable to deliver, has operated sort of in an opaque manner from the perspective of citizens. You have an extremely weak civil society, an early emergence of civic groups and political parties. So everybody is trying to feel their way through this process. Yeah. The question is, are these people, again, ready for democracy, that the Muslim Brotherhood has one, it's the notion of, one man, one vote, one time. This is this notion that somehow an entire people are different from the rest of the world, that they're somehow not ready to have a political voice and to believe these things. And I'm telling you, if you take a poll of Arabs, in terms of what they want, in terms of democratic government. But the low is about 78% in Yemen, and the high is 96% in Jordan. It's about the same anywhere else in the world. They want the same thing. They want to elect their leaders. They want to have an independent judiciary. They want, there are issues regarding value issues. There's debates over values. But we have debates all the time over values. And we'll have debates over values for many years. But ultimately, they want that. I don't believe, because you have the Iranian Revolution, that this is, they're not Arabs, they're Persians. That somehow this is what everybody else wants. Even on the West Bank, you had Hamas that was voted in, and then you had Hamas that was voted out a few years later because they were unable to deliver. And there is no sign that any of these Islamist parties are trying to pursue a policy that there'll be one election. And until such time as they do, I think we have to give them the benefit of the doubt. We have to hold them to certain fundamental standards, universal standards, and their commitments and their statements. But I don't see any evidence. In Eastern Europe, after the fall of the wall, it was 10 years before you had a democratic transition in Slovakia, 10 years before Milosevic was overthrown, years in Romania. People forget that, and still in Bosnia now, you're having huge ethnic strife between the Croats, the Serbs, and the Bosniaks. No, I think it requires patience and it requires long-term engagement, but they're no different than anybody else. And when you work on the ground with people, you realize that they want the same thing as everybody else. And I think they'll demand it, yes. The question is sort of double standardism a little bit, that in the case of Egypt, all the evidence is that we're on the side of the military. In Syria, have not been as assertive as we possibly could. In Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, we have not been as assertive as we possibly could, and because of their incursion into Bahrain. And I would recommend that you read something. On our website, ndi.org, there is a speech by Secretary Clinton that she delivered last November at our annual dinner. We have an annual democracy dinner. And this year we honored posthumously Geraldine Ferraro, who was a long-term member of our board, Richard Holbrooke, and Charles Manat, the former chairman of the Democratic Party, who was for a short time our first chairman at NDI. And their families were there, and then Secretary Clinton came and delivered the keynote address. And there was a big debate whether her address should be sort of a 10-minute welcoming, and it's very nice to be here, and I like democracy, and leave, or was this going to be a major foreign policy address? And there was a fight within the administration over this. Should be a major, should this not, perfunctory? And it was turned into a major foreign policy speech, and it was 40 minutes. And she talked about just those issues. And I think, and as my chairman, Madeleine Albright, she will tell you it's tough when you sit behind that desk and have to make decisions. And it's very, very, and I'm not here to defend the administration, and generally we don't take positions on U.S. foreign policy, because we receive most of our money from the U.S. government. Although we also receive money from foreign governments, the British, the Dutch, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Canadians, the Irish, that have invested in the programs that we do on the ground. But it's very difficult sometimes to be consistent in this. And the administration has been criticized by human rights groups for not being as assertive as they have been in Bahrain. The administration was criticized for waiving the requirements for providing the $1.3 billion in military aid. The Leahy Amendment, which required certain benchmarks before that $1.3 billion could be released. God bless you. But it provided a waiver for national security, and the administration waived it. And I think one of the reasons was you had production lines. And if those production lines did not continue, it would have been whopping penalties that the United States government would have to give to defense contractors. And it was a judgment call. And all of these things are difficult issues, and there are fights within the administration over these issues. And some of those fights I have seen personally, because sometimes they come in and ask for our views on some of these issues. Most of the time they don't. The president's got enough advisors. He doesn't need more. And I think organizations like ours would always argue that the democracy issue should not be 8th on the agenda. It should be maybe not number 1, because we understand that there are other interests at play, but it should be higher than 8th. And sometimes we create a situation where it forces the administration to deal on these issues. What happened in Egypt to us, we were the canary in the coal mine in Egypt. What they were doing to us, we could deal with, but it was what they were doing to their own people. We were just a low-hanging fruit. And so sometimes it forces the administration, this administration or the previous administration, to come to our defense and come to the defense of local groups. And the Secretary has established a number of important initiatives on defense of civil society. But there are times where immediate short-term interests dominate. It was true in Kyrgyzstan before the revolution with the Manas Air Base. And this will always be the case, this tug of where it is. And there will always be these debates. But I do believe that if you look at where we are, the U.S. today, from where we are 30 years ago, it is a big difference. And I like to think that organizations like mine have helped contribute to that change. But there will be a creative struggle, and the Secretary's speech reflected that struggle. And so I would urge you to read it.
Certainly the questions which have been asked tonight have covered a wide amount of territory, and the answers to them have been terrific, I think. It's been a very an extraordinarily comprehensive treatment, I think, and very nicely done. And I think a wonderful view of someone who's devoted 25 years of their life to working on these problems and the difficult task of advocating democracy. And so for us who have appreciated that and like the fact that you've shared the evening with us, I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.